Welcome back to Introduction to Fine Arts. Today we are going to begin our discussion on ancient Rome. Ancient Rome is so often compared to us. For post-World War II United States, it's perhaps the closest analog we have in all of history. And ancient Rome had a massive influence on our own constitution and political structure. Checks and balances, particularly between the power of the elites and the power of the mob, or everyday people, was one of its most crucial features. But that's just one example of the myriad ways in which Rome has influenced our own politics. Rome's 482-year-long republic is still the longest the world has ever seen. But it all fell apart. What took place in Rome is a lesson that we, in contemporary American society, could sure use today. It teaches us the dangers of condoning political obstruction and courting political violence. Says historian Edward Watts, when citizens look away as their leaders engage in these corrosive behaviors, the republic is in mortal danger. And that's exactly what happened to Rome. But first, some context. These dates are problematic, to say the least. 753 BCE is the legendary founding of the city by Romulus and Remus. Not necessarily accurate, but symbolically it marks the starting point. 476 CE is even more difficult. This is the date the last emperor in the West was deposed. The empire in the West had already been gone for all practical purposes, and Rome in the East continued for another 1,000 years, so there's that. You can almost write 1453 CE here in that sense. Well, sort of. Before discussing Rome, let's talk about the people who were in the area before them. In fact, in some ways, just a broader category of early Romans, the Etruscans. They were a mysterious people. Their specific origins are unknown. They had a Greek-like alphabet, but the vocabulary, we just don't have any really good idea about it. The location of the Etruscan culture is modern-day central Italy, what's called today Tuscany. In fact, they controlled much of the Italian peninsula for a couple centuries. They were skilled seafarers. They lived in walled city-states on hilltops, and they never really united as a single kingdom. They certainly had interactions with the archaic Greeks. The Greek influence is everywhere. Except women in society, it was a very different thing. They had much more respect than with the typical Greek city-state. They participated in civic affairs. They had a certain amount of independence and freedom. They could even hold property in their names. All this really freaked out the Greeks. They seem to be religiously minded in a sense. Most of their known art comes from tombs. But that could be, we just might think that because the Romans didn't plunder their tombs. And the religion was influenced heavily by the Greeks. The artwork itself was somewhat similar in intent with the Egyptians, as in the afterlife. But stylistically, it's very different and more akin to what the Greeks were doing at this time. There were terracotta sculptures, mostly life-size, and bronze statues. There were wall paintings and tombs, and there was metalwork. Mining was a large source of their wealth as a culture. There's a big influence from archaic Greece, it seems, among other peoples, but their style was unique and even had a cross-cultural influence with the Greeks. It went both ways, I think. Their work was often funerary in content, but it was filled with strength and vigor, very much unlike Egypt. And it just really seemed to be a celebration of life. But let's look at some architecture first. Here's the temple at Veii. Stylistically, it's similar to the Greeks, but often made from wood with this wattle and daub technique on top of a stone podium. Their temples were smaller than the Greek temples, and the side walls were filled in rather than being left open. And these temples were adorned with figurative art, but instead of in the pediments, it was on the rooftops. And as we look at sculpture, we'll see one such adornment. This is Apullu of Veii. It's made from terracotta, and it was life-sized, similar to some of the Greek sculpture that we would see at this time. but there are some notable exceptions. You see in the Etruscan statue this extraordinary force, these huge swelling contours in the sculpture and plunging motion with a truly animated face instead of that sort of constipated, archaic smile. Its discovery in 1916 caused a reevaluation of the Etruscan relationship to Greek art. People started to question who really influenced who. And here we have the sarcophagus from Cerveteri. What's shown as a husband and wife reclining on a banquet couch. The wife actually seems to have something to say. It's as if the husband is like, yeah, what she said. To the Greeks, that would have seemed absurd, a scandal. But we see with these sculptures animated gestures. Compared this to Egyptian funerary sculpture that was so stodgy and severe. And there's also little precedent for this kind of vitality in Greek art. The Etruscans were masters at bronze casting. Here's the Chimera of Arezzo. This is kind of indicative of the Etruscan penchant for these animal monster hybrid statues. In this profile view, we can really see the tensed muscles and the gaunt ribs. This creature is animated and ferocious. Just linger on this for a while. Look at the anatomy. Look at the bones coming through the skin. And just that sense of movement. It's amazing. But I think some of the most interesting Etruscan art is the wall painting. And the paintings were done in these family tombs. People were buried in mounds called tumuli, and they were used by successive generations in a single family. And these were houses for the afterlife. The Tomb of the Leopards is a great example of Etruscan wall painting. It's funerary, like Egypt, but it's alive. There's all sorts of vitality and energy. Here's a banquet scene with musicians, entertainers, and servants. You see these exaggerated hands. There's a lot of hand gesticulation. We all know people who talk with their hands. The Etruscans sure seem to be those people. We see couples relaxing and enjoying themselves. There's a real celebration of life. It makes Etruscan art, not unique, but kind of unique in a lot of these ancient cultures. Maybe the Minoans would be another example that we would see something like this. But after a series of wars and conflicts around the early 1st century BCE, they were just sort of annexed by Rome. Roman citizenship was given to all Etruscans. Etruscan art becomes Roman art. But in many ways, Rome was an Etruscan city. It was on the edge of Etruscan territory, culturally similar. In fact, Etruscan kings ruled it for a time. Trying to distinguish the finer points between the two cultures at this time is confusing. And that brings us to the Roman Republic. Starting from when they gave the boot to the last of their kings until the Battle of Actium that shifted power into the hands of Octavian, or Augustus as he would later come to rename himself. 509 to 31 BCE. This sculpture epitomizes the Roman Republic better than any other, the Capitoline she-wolf. It's a great example of the similarity between the Etruscans and the Romans stylistically. In fact, it's technically considered Etruscan, but it's also very much Roman. The style is quintessentially Etruscan. Cast bronze, see this wolf bearing teeth. This isn't the best angle. She looks a little wimpy here. But we see the tensed muscles and the skeletal structure through the skin. But the content depicts the legendary founders of Rome. Well, kind of. The kids beneath it were added much later in the Renaissance. One of those mysteriously misguided commissions of revisionist history. Now, there are contradictory stories about the founding of Rome, but basically, Romulus and Remus were brothers born to Latin royalty, but really fathered by Mars, the god, not the king. They were left to die because of an unfavorable prophecy regarding the king. Miraculously, they were saved by a she-wolf who nursed them back to health and adopted by a shepherd family. They went on to kill their father and start a glorious new city-state. Oh, and by the way, Romulus killed Remus over an argument about the location. Of course, you can see shades of all sorts of biblical stories, but as you've seen, those get rehashed all throughout the ancient world. But this fascinating legend reveals Rome's moral values. The story coalesced rather late in their history, but it's their official history nonetheless. The early history of Rome lives up to this moral pragmatism. On one such occasion, Rome didn't have enough young women in the city to sufficiently propagate. But the neighboring Sabines had plenty. So the Romans throw a big party, get the Sabines drunk, then kidnap their daughters and take them back to Rome. Well, eventually the two cities work things out. All right, so we've talked about the classical era, that term that encompasses the classical period of Greece and the Roman Republic, basically. And these two periods of time from different cultures, in a lot of ways, form the basis of our whole society. The United States was founded at a time when classicism was all the rage amongst intellectuals. The United States government structure is also reflective of classical Greece and Rome. The formal tradition of architecture, like the United States Capitol building and lots of other examples, indicate this influence of Roman culture and architecture. More important, you see echoes all throughout contemporary United States of ancient Rome, positives and negatives. Rome is well represented in popular culture. What are some of the contributions? So we talked about architecture, absolutely. Engineering was something that the Romans completely excelled at. They were able to achieve amazing feats of engineering prowess. The Romans also were responsible for preserving Greek art and culture that came kind of before them that they were so fascinated by. Much of Greek art was copied by Rome, and that's how we know about it. The Romans were also masters of using art as propaganda. They really knew how to use imagery to boost someone's image and to influence the way people thought about things. Social organization is Rome's most lasting achievement, though. They were masters at politics and administration of government. The Republic of Rome is ruled by an assembly, a senate, and 2 consuls. And culturally, it was divided into 2 distinct classes. And this class distinction lasts throughout Rome's history. The patricians, or the patres in the book, were descendants of the original wealthy citizens, the fathers of Rome. The plebeians, or the plebs, were the lower class. They were the people that weren't descended from important families. But that doesn't mean they didn't have money. Some had lots of money, which bought them some influence and power regardless of their family standing. And the conflict between these 2 groups was a constant all throughout the history of Rome. As Rome was ascending into prominence around the Mediterranean, there was another culture across the sea that was also very important, and that was Carthage. And eventually they came to blows, and that was the Punic Wars. And it was a huge significance to the spread of Roman power in the region. So Rome versus Carthage, city-state in North Africa, present-day Tunisia. This is where Hannibal, who you've read about, and his elephants crossed the Alps, and they nearly defeated Rome. And who knows how that would have changed history. But Rome survived and went on to defeat Carthage, and Carthage was utterly destroyed by Rome. Awful carnage. But Rome was victorious. The Punic Wars left Rome the sole superpower of the Mediterranean. On this map, you can see how their territory expanded over time. By the end of the Punic Wars, pretty much the whole of the Mediterranean was under their control, and their power keeps spreading after that for quite some time. This map basically shows the extent of the Roman dominance until the end of the Republic. Rome's sculptural tradition was really interesting. You see these veristic patrician busts. The aristocracy of Rome kept these as status symbols. They were images of their ancestors, proof of their lineage, and they would store them in their houses in grand rooms and then parade them around at funerals and parades. They portrayed their ancestors in old age as sort of a respect for elders. They played up the hyper-detailed wrinkles in the depictions of the faces, which is a big contrast to what we saw in ancient Greece. Most were just busts, but some, even more interesting, they were whole figures with bodies that were idealized like Greek sculpture, but with these hyper-realistic, veristic heads that were not idealized at all. Imagine growing up in a house where you saw these likenesses of your forebears and were constantly told of their exploits and glory, and having it drilled into you that you need to rise to even higher greatness at all cost. It was an extremely ambitious society. Here we can see how unlike their Greek counterparts they were. With the Greeks, we see this kind of Pythagorean, humanistic whole body and this idea of aesthetic perfection. But with the Romans, it was more about this status symbol, totally different way of approaching sculpture. In the architecture of the Roman Republic period, we see some interesting things as well. Here's the Temple of Fortuna. We see Ionian columns, but later in Rome, the columns were Corinthian, a lot more ornate. But this temple is smaller than the Greek counterparts. It was private. It was a closed-in space, sort of like the Etruscans built. It had the same symmetry as the Greeks, though. You can see here in this plan. We talked earlier about the ambition and drive of Roman society that was valued above all else, to win fame and fortune for your family. The classical ideal of individual achievement had a dark underbelly. It provided motivation for fame and renown that created a class of highly ambitious men. That's a good thing. Competition is healthy, and Rome became immensely powerful because of it. But it was also a bad thing, because competition can get out of hand and could become detrimental to stability of the society. Extreme economic stratification and a loosening of political taboos created a powder keg in Roman society. Sometimes this resulted in real crises, even civil war throughout a long period of time. But between 44 and 31 BCE, it brought down the Republic itself. It tore apart the fabric of Roman society and culture. University of California, San Diego historian Edward Watts, in his 2018 book, The Mortal Republic, How Rome Fell into Tyranny, chronicles the way the Republic, with a population once devoted to national service and personal honor, was torn to shreds by growing wealth inequality, partisan gridlock, political violence, and pandering politicians. He argues that the people of Rome essentially chose to let their democracy die by not protecting their political institutions. And when it all went to hell, they turned to the stability of an emperor instead of facing the continued violence of an unstable and degraded republic. Political messaging during the 2020 election has hinged on many of these exact topics, and I'm sure we'll do so again next time around. When Octavian, the nephew of Julius Caesar, finally defeated the last of his opponents at the Battle of Actium and became Augustus, the Republic ceased to exist, except for it was still called a Republic. It's sort of funny the Republic was finished, but it's really hard to tell if most Romans really knew that at the time or not. Perhaps it was like the frog in boiling water. I wonder what the temperature of our own bathwater is right now if we bothered to check. There's a kind of old HBO miniseries about this period that is somewhat true to broad historical events and the feel of Rome in general at the time, if not some of the specific characters, and it's worth checking out. Also, Dan Carlin has an incredible podcast series documenting the Roman Republic's demise, and a link to that is posted on Canvas. It costs money, but it's so worth it if you're interested in this sort of thing. It's basically a very entertaining audiobook. Next time, we'll talk about what comes next for Rome, its citizens, its subjects, and its neighbors.